Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 3, Visual Elements. Now this chapter we will introduce several visual elements like line, shape, mass, space, time, motion, light, color, and texture. So just a warning, there's going to be a lot of vocabulary, so make sure you take good notes. And actually for this particular chapter, I will suggest that you go back to your textbook and look up all the bolded text. They're important vocabularies for you to know, and just do a little bit of review on your own. Okay, so let's begin. So our very first basic element that we're going to talk about is line. So line is our basic means for recording and symbolizing ideas, observations, and feelings. It is a primary means of visual communication. So before anybody can paint, they need to learn how to use lines to do sketches and drawings. Now, I'm sure we all know what lines are, but I just want to show you a few examples of implied lines. So the image on the very far left, obviously, is just an actual line. But the middle image right here is what we call an implied line. Now, as you can see, there's not actually a line there. There are a series of dots arranged in a certain way that implies that there is a curved line. And to push it even further, the image on the right we see is actual straight lines, and it implies a curved line on the very top. So by arranging the straight lines in various length, you imply that there is a curved shape and a curved line. Now, a lot of the times when we think about lines, we think about a two-dimensional area, right? When you draw, you're drawing on a piece of paper, which is a two-dimensional surface. But here in this particular installation, you can see that the artist is pushing the boundary of a two-dimensional element, which is lines. And he did this particular installation to make it look like they're just lines, but obviously it's in the 3D space. Now in this painting, even more we see the implied line in a two-dimensional way. So this painting is called I and the Village by Marc Chagall. It's oil on canvas and done in 1911. As you can see in this painting, there's actually no lines, but all the implied lines are created by different colors and different ways of painting. So you can see that the curves right outside the man's mouth continues and almost make a full circle. All right, the next element is shape. There are two kinds of shapes. There are two categories. So the first category is geometric shapes. And what geometric shapes are, there are triangles, circles, squares, and they tend to be precise and regular. And then the second categories of shapes are organic shapes. And what organic shapes are, they're irregular and they're often curving or rounded and seem more relaxed and informal. So just like lines, they're implied lines, shapes also have implied shapes. So this is demonstrated perfectly in this particular image, that at first glance you might see the two black shapes that are opposing each other and you don't see anything else. But as you observe this image a little bit further, you can see that there's actually a white square that is implied by placing these two particular objects together. All right, now we will move on to mass. Just like shape is the area of a two-dimensional area, mass is actually a three-dimensional area. Now there are two types of masses, and sometimes you can also use the word form for mass. So the two different types of mass is closed form mass and also open form mass. And here is an illustration, an example for you to see that there are two very different looking sculptures. They both take up space, right? They both have mass, but the one on the left is what we call an open form sculpture because the figure reaches out. It interacts with its surrounding space, okay? And the sculpture on the right, the horse, is something we called a closed form sculpture because it is not openly interacting with the surrounding space. It's very square looking, it's very weighty looking, and is very stationary looking. All right, next we will be talking about space. Now, when we talk about space, many times we think about 3D and three-dimensional spaces. Now, space is the indefinable general receptacle of all things, the seemingly empty space around us. When we think about space, like I said, we think more in the three-dimensional way. A room or a house or a particular space that is large or small. We're always thinking about in a three-dimensional way. But I want to show you that even with space, you can have implied space in a two-dimensional aspect. So here we see that how to play with two-dimensional implied space to create depth. So here you see in the diagrams, you have different variations and different sizes of emplacements of circles. You can overlap them, you can overlap in diminishing sizes, vertical placements, overlapping vertical placement, and diminishing sizes to imply depth. So on the very far right image, as you can see, the larger the circle is and the lower it is in the image, the closer it appears to be to us. And the smaller the circle it is and the higher it is in the image, the furthest it seems to be with us. Okay? So our very next element we're going to talk about is motion. And very similarly to the other elements that we have been talking about, there is implied motion in artwork, and there is also actual motion in pieces of art. Now, with implied motion, here's a very good example of implied motion. This piece is called Dynamism of a Human Body Footballer. Now, in America, we call football soccers, but in the UK, they call it football. So Umberto Boccioni, he was observing these footballers playing soccer, and instead of drawing them just like a human being, maybe running or kicking and jumping, he only recorded the lines where their body parts were. So as they're kicking, he draw a line for where their feet was swinging, and when they're throwing their head up, maybe he draws another line indicating where the head was hitting the ball. So actually, when you look at this painting, this drawing, it's a bit abstract, but at the same time, you can see the lines dancing on the paper really give you the sense of motion. Now, there are actual sculptures or work of art that moves in space. And these work of art or sculptures are called kinetic art. And that is spelled Kinetic, kinetic art. And this is an example of kinetic art by Alexander Calder. This piece called Untitled is right now installed in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. All right, so now we come to the element of light. And light, again, we can be talking about implied light in paintings and drawings and even in photographs, or we can be talking about light as an actual medium to create art. But before we continue, we need to talk about value a little bit, because value and light goes hand in hand. Value refers to the relative lightness and darkness of surface. Value ranges from white through various of gray to black. So as you can see in the image below, the very middle line, the middle bar, is what we called a middle gray. Middle gray simply means you have 50% white plus 50% black. It's the very middle grade value. Now the middle bar is contrasted with a background of white to black, and as you can see, the gray is very relative to its surroundings. because a gray that is in front of a white background seems darker, and a gray that is in front of a black background seems lighter. Now, how do you create an implied value or implied light in a painting? The technique of shading from light to dark to create the illusion of volume is called chiaroscuro. So in this particular painting called Harvest Season by Rosa Bonheur, she did exactly that. As you see in this painting, you see the very light value of white in the worker's shirt and a little bit in the sky. And you also see the darkest value of black in the shadows. But notice the animals in the middle of this picture. She skillfully used a shading technique and with color to really create a sense of volume and depth and roundness to their body. So you can have the feeling that the sun is shining on top of them and creating these depth into this painting. All right, so let's talk about light as a medium. So what that means is just that artists uses light itself to create art. So like in our very first chapter, we were talking about her secret is patience, that particular installation piece in Phoenix. I don't know if you remember or not. She uses light as part of her medium, just like this piece right here. This artist decided that in his installation he will include neon light to further illustrate his message. All right, our very next element is color. So when we talk about color, we're going to be talking about three separate aspects of color. We'll be talking about the physics of color, the pigment and light, and then we'll be talking about color schemes. So here's the physics of color, and the phenomenon of color is really a paradox. So color exists only in light, but light itself, a lot of the times when we turn on the light, we don't really see any color. So light itself seems colorless to our eyes. But objects appears to have color, so how does it work? So in 1666, scientist Isaac Newton, he discovered that white light is actually composed of all the colors of the spectrum. He found that when the white light of the sun passed through a glass prism, it actually separates into different bands of color that make up the visible spectrum. And actually, this is the same phenomenon that we see with rainbows. When the light hit the raindrop a certain way, the raindrops separates the white light into different spectrum of light. Therefore, we see red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. So what is more interesting with light is then when we see an object that is green, what that really means is that that object is absorbing all the colors of the light except green. So green is then reflected off the object and into our eyes. So same thing with a red apple. The skin of the apple is actually absorbing all the colors of the light, like green and violet and blue and purple and maybe a little bit of orange, and it's reflecting back to our eyes the redness. So this is very interesting. Now, here's where it gets a little bit complicated. There are actually 3 dimensions of color. There is hue, there is value, and there is intensity. Now, hue refers to a particular wavelength of spectrum color to which we give a name. So colors of the spectrum such as yellow and green are called hue. So green is a hue, yellow is a hue, orange is a hue, red is a hue. Then we come to value. Value refers to relative lightness or darkness from white through grays to black, like we just mentioned before when we were talking about light. So pure hues vary in value. So as you can see, on the right hand side, there are three bars. The very top bar refers to hue, and the second bar refers to value. Oh, excuse me, the first bar is actually refers to value. You see it goes from light to dark. And when we apply colors to that value, we see that with a pure hue in the middle, like a pure red, the lighter value you get, the more pink it looks. And the more value you add to it, the darker it gets and the more brown it looks. Now, the third dimension of color is intensity. Intensity also is called saturation. So what this refers to is the purity of a hue or a color. So as you can see, the very last bar on the right hand side, you have yellow on the left and violet on the right. And as you start to mix those two colors together, the duller it gets in the middle, the less intense it gets, the less saturated either of those colors are. All right, so now let's talk about the color wheels. So there are three different types of colors. So as we can see, here we have primary, secondary, and intermediate. So when we talk about primary hues or primary colors, we're talking about red, yellow, and blue. And these are actually what we call pigment hues, and it cannot be produced by any intermixing of other hues. So we call them primary colors. In primary color, red, yellow, and blue technically can make all the possible colors in the world just by these three colors. Now, we have secondary hues, or we sometimes call secondary colors, and these are simply a mix between two primary colors. So for example, red and yellow makes orange. Yellow and blue makes green. Red and blue makes violet. And so these colors are the colors that are in the middle of two primary colors on the color wheel. So now I'm pretty sure you guessed it, intermediate color is when you mix a primary color and a secondary color together. That's why the names for these intermediate colors is always a primary color plus a secondary color. So like red orange, blue green, yellow orange, or red violet, etc. All right, so what is interesting is that on the color wheel, we have the warm colors and the cool colors. So warm colors are like orange, yellow, and red, and cool colors are like green, blue, and yellow-green. And so what is an interesting phenomenon is if you look at these two circles closely and if you stare at it long enough, you start to feel like the red circle is actually bigger than the blue circle. And that's because there's the optical illusion that warm colors tends to expand and tends to make things seem larger than they actually are. All right, so lastly with colors, let's talk about color schemes. So there are two types of color schemes. We have analogous color scheme and then we have complementary color scheme. So what analogous means is just that it's a color scheme that uses color that are adjacent, which means next to each other, on the color wheel. And complementary colors are color schemes that are using colors that are directly opposite the color wheel. So for example, a complementary color will be yellow and violet, or red and green, or blue and orange. An analogous color scheme will be like yellow and yellow-green and green, or blue-green, blue and blue-violet, colors that are next to each other on the color schemes. All right, our next element and our last element is texture. Texture refers to the tactile quality of surfaces or to the visual representation of those qualities. Now, if you have an actual sculpture in front of you or an actual object in front of you, when you touch it, you could feel the texture of it. But if it's simply a photograph like this one right here, and I excuse for the quality, it's very pixelated, but this is the artwork by Mairead Oppenheim. It's called Breakfast in Fur. Obviously, as you can tell, these are saucepans, cups and spoon cover in fur. Now you can feel the texture, not by touching it, because right now nobody can actually touch it, it's in your computer screen, but there is the implied texture in the photograph. It's almost as if you reach through the screen, you touch it, you would be able to know how it feels. So this is the texture that you can see in paintings and photography. Now, what is interesting is that paintings like Starry Night by Van Gogh, it is done with this particular technique called impasto. And what that means is just texture created with strokes of thick paint. So as he's painting, he's layering on very thick paint with his paintbrushes and creating actual textures on the painting itself. So if you were to touch the painting, of course, you won't be able to because it's in a museum and they'll probably arrest you for that. But if you actually are able to touch the painting, you could feel the layers of paint that is dried on the canvas. All right, so that is it for chapter 3. And again, like I said, we have gone through many vocabularies. And before you take the test, which will cover chapter 1, 2, and 3, I would suggest that you either go back and rewatch some of the videos if you missed parts of it, or you take out your textbook and really read through some of the bolded text. You don't have to read the whole thing, but if you kind of just look through the texts that are bolded and look up their definition, you should do fine. All right, everyone, have a good weekend and good luck on your test.